You're listening to the Subrogation Support Network, a podcast from Mattison, Wickert & Layer, America's subrogation law firm, with dissemination of new developments and changes in subrogation law, as well as emerging trends and best practices. Here's your host, Ashton Kirsch.
Hello, everybody. This is Ashton Kirsch, your host for today's Subrogation Support Network podcast, what I believe to be the best subrogation-related podcast out there, and frankly, I think maybe the only or one of the only Subro podcasts. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to have one of our attorneys here at MWL, Raven Jelinski, joining me. Raven, how are you doing today?
Hi, Ashton. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Raven, tell me a bit about yourself so that the audience can get to know you before we kind of jump into the meat of this fascinating topic on misdig claims.
Absolutely. So like Ashton said, my name is Raven Jelinski. I am a litigation defense and subrogation associate attorney here at Mattison, Wickert & Layer's Hartford, Wisconsin office. So my background is largely litigation defense, insurance coverage, as well as subrogation litigation. So a lot of what I specialize in is our classic property damage subrogation, auto collision subrogation, as well as MedPay, PIP, UIM, and kind of the alphabet soup of insurance.
And Raven has done an amazing job working with me on a lot of these misdig claims. So let's just jump into it then, Raven. So
Ashton, why don't you start by telling us what a misdig claim is?
Beautiful. Misdig claims. So we represent a number of telecommunications companies, oil and gas companies, energy companies. And obviously, these utility companies have cables and lines and conduits and facilities underground and also aerially, right? Those are the aerial pole-to-pole lines. And it kind of amazes me how often this occurs. But every day, contractors are digging, right? Digging to build, put in new lines, digging to plant gardens, digging to trench out to install a new lateral, right? They're digging for a number of reasons, constructing houses, whatever it is, and they're striking facilities, right? They're striking that cable and they're causing significant damages. So all of these utility companies have, just a huge amount of these claims. And over the last few years, MWL, we've really developed a pretty significant and specific practice area handling these cases against primarily the contractors, sometimes the marking companies, when they cause these damages. These can be really fact-specific, really labor-intensive on the investigative end, because oftentimes it's about figuring out, was the facility appropriately marked? Where was it marked? How did the damage occur? And on an evidentiary basis, it can get complex because a lot of times that utility company, the plaintiff here, they don't really know that the damage has occurred until they're informed of a service outage. Hopefully, and usually it's immediately thereafter because a customer calls them up, or even sometimes the defendant damager contacts them and says, hey, we hit your line. But there are situations where it could be weeks or even months later. Let's say a new subdivision is being developed and they don't have any telecom, right? They don't have any internet. Nobody's using the facilities, so they don't know until later. But ultimately, that's, we'll get deep into this. We'll talk a bit about the hypotheticals and so forth. Raven, give me an idea of an example claim that you've handled so that we can kind of tell the audience a bit about this.
Sure. So these claims can spread across various types of work performed. So our most common claim that we get is we have a construction project. Someone is building maybe a new fast food restaurant, and they are excavating, digging, using a boring machine, an auger, some kind of a construction equipment here, and they're digging, and all of a sudden, boom, they strike typically a private communications line, so a telephone line usually. And so that's kind of one of the more basic claims that we see most often. I've also started to see a trend towards a lot of homeowners digging on their own property, and they don't think to call 811. Weather's getting warmer, they want to do some work in their gardens, they want to install some handrails with their stairs. So there are issues like that where, boom, they hit, a water line, a gas line, an electric line, and suddenly there's an outage in their neighborhood.
Well, I can tell you, just personally speaking, we have a house being built next to mine. And of course, contractor just a few months ago digging, and they struck a utility line. They actually struck the gas line going into the house. And of course, the energy company had to come out, or the gas and energy company came out. They had to dig a huge hole in my yard because that's where the shutoff valve was. And they came out and fixed it and everything. But it kind of suggested to me how common this is. I think in situations I was planting arborvitaes in my house, was it last year or so? And I started digging down and frankly, not even thinking about it. I hit a big metal line. I guess it was also a gas line. I quickly, when I hit it, it was with a shovel and it just went ding and I stopped digging. But sometimes, somebody's digging and they hit something hard and they pull out that pickaxe and next thing you know, they start smacking at it, smacking, and they cause a huge issue. So that's why it's so important. And that's why these claims happen all the time. I mean, most of us have at least dug on our property once in our lives. It happens often. So today, I kind of want to hopefully go back and forth with you, discuss kind of the basic procedure for 811 claims so the audience knows how this works, discuss a bit about who we can pursue. If we get the chance, discuss some of the common defenses that we see on these cases that are raised by the contractors or any other defendant for that matter. Discuss some of the evidentiary issues because that's huge, right? I think evidence and our burden of proof can sometimes be tough to prove up on these cases. And finally, given time permitting, you know me, I always like to talk negotiations. We can talk about some of those things I found to work in negotiating these cases. So just to begin, let's start talking about the basics of who we can pursue. Raven, tell me a bit about who the primary defendants are in these actions.
Absolutely. So like we had previously talked about, these types of claims are very widely spread across the board. So I did a little bit of research and it looks like over half of projects proceed without calling 811 before digging. So this is homeowners, this is contractor claims. So in these types of situations, we're going to look towards the person who caused the damage, be it the private homeowner, the homeowner's friend who was doing a favor and installing a fence, any kind of general contractor or subcontractors that were on site or around that were digging or that were tasked with digging. And then we're going to look at the company who hired the contractor themselves, any person or party that was responsible for calling 811, your state's diggers hotline, and maybe failed to do so or provided less accurate information, maybe went beyond the scope of any 811 ticket that was granted. In any kind of private marking company that came on site to mark and locate private utility companies. What a lot of contractors and maybe individuals don't necessarily realize is that 811 will come out and they'll mark public utilities, your water, your sewer, whereas with private and telecommunications lines, you will need to contact a private locate company, which is most commonly the United States Infrastructure Corporation and related companies, USIC. So a lot of our claims are against the contractor who caused the damage. And we usually kind of try and investigate, figure out who was on site, who actually struck the line, and then we move on from there.
Absolutely. And one thing to note is you'd mentioned the difference between kind of those public and private utilities on the property. Things get really complex because a lot of times if it's a homeowner doing the digging or even a contractor there for the homeowner, if you don't understand this, there's a lot of potential for disaster to occur because we've had cases where contractor starts digging, let's say I had a recent one where they're building a new garage. They start digging and they hit a line. Well, they called 811. It was supposed to be marked. Well, then you find out that the cable, it was actually, it was a power cable that was hit, was running to a building, a shed on the property that had lights, electricity in there. And that was never marked through 811 because that was on their private property. That is their responsibility. So as homeowners, they have to go beyond that, right? 811 is not the only way, but just keep that in mind, kind of a tangential item. But before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of it, I think it's important for the audience because frankly, before I started handling these claims, I didn't know anything about the process. So let's walk through the process a little bit. So I'm going to kind of give you the step-by-step on what happens when you're going to dig and kind of what the basic outline of facts are before we get involved when a contractor hits a line. So step one, anytime a contractor is going to dig, anytime they're going to excavate on a property, be it by hand or by heavy equipment, they have a duty and an obligation to call 811. And what 811 is it's also known as Digger's Hotline, right? Public number, you call that number, you're going to talk to somebody, you're going to open a ticket. you're pretty much going to, you can talk over the phone or there are online portals so that you can file for a ticket there. But what you're going to do is you're going to outline, here's what we're doing. Here's the scope of the project. Here's what we need. And you're going to go out and you're going to say, I need to have this marked. I need to know where the utilities are. Okay. 811 is then going to open a ticket, at which point in time, they're going to review the plat maps. They're going to review the markings to figure out where exactly utilities may be on that property. From there, a backstory. So any utility company, anyone who has lines in the ground, they need to be members of 811. And in doing so, they need to inform 811, inform the requisite authorities where they have cables, where they have facilities, lines, and so forth. And in doing so, then 811 is going to typically have the information that they can then inform anybody who potentially has cables, lines, utilities on the property. What they then do is they then inform either that company, be it ABC Telecommunications Company, XYZ Energy Association, and they're going to inform them of this. Some of those companies have a registered agent who they'll inform on their behalf, oftentimes the marking company directly. USIC is one of the big ones out there. There's very few, but there's, about 5 or 6 that you'll often see. And what will happen then is within a requisite period of time, that ticket's open for a series of days or weeks. And then that marking company has to go out and they have to mark all of the facilities within that period of time, right? And by marking, that means they go out, they use spray paint, flags, whatever it means to put lines, and we'll discuss those lines, what the colors, what everything means soon. But in the end, that's really what happens. The marking company then goes out, marks it, and then there'll be a work by date. And by that date, it should all be marked. And then the contractor, the excavator can go out and dig. Oftentimes also, it'll be the responsibility of that contractor, whomever, to mark on the ground or somehow designate with usually as white paint, spray paint, to show where their excavation area is going to be to assist the marking company. On larger projects, there's going to be situations where there's a joint meeting. They call it on-site meetings where all of the owners of the utilities sent a representative out. They kind of work together to make sure all markings are in line, everything's appropriate. So, ultimately, I just looking online, you can see that some of these marking companies, we have hundreds of millions of locates done every year. I mean, it's a huge number. I mean, just the sheer amount is insane. So Raven, I think it's important to also, when the marking company gets out there, right? So contractors called 811. 811 is identified XYZ Energy Company. XYZ Energy Company is called their locate vendor. Locate vendor then goes to the scene to mark. Walk me through kind of what they're doing. Are they using tools? How are they figuring out where these lines and cables are?
Sure. So USIC 811, most of the time they've got detection software that will help them locate these utility lines, private and public. So typically these are marked by flags, spray paint, or these color-coded materials, typically flags and spray paint. So essentially once this area is marked with a specific color, and I can run through the colors momentarily. So once those lines are marked, these contractors are supposed to hand dig within what's called a zone of tolerance. So this varies by state. So there will be at least 50 sets of rules. So this will depend on your respective state. But typically, once this area is located, you're supposed to hand dig within 3 to 5 or 2 to 5 feet from that center. So this is where we see a lot of issues where maybe the contractor did not hand dig, or they used heavy machinery like the augers and these excavators, or they just use really sharp tools when they were hand digging. So essentially this zone of tolerance is kind of a margin of error, so to speak, because USIC 811, they're not perfect. These still have a certain human element to locating these utility lines. So that's why it's important to kind of give some space. And because with erosion, some of these lines can move over time. So it's important to be hand digging using blunt tools, no pickaxes, no sharp edges, just to make sure that you're not accidentally nicking and severing these lines.
Yeah, that's really important to note. So, so just in general, what happens is it's marked, right? You have the orange lines, it's going through, there's a dashed line. Contractor comes out, they're like, all right, it's been marked, I can dig. Oftentimes in the current environment, contractors aren't usually just hand digging with a shovel for huge excavation projects. They're using heavy equipment. They're using excavators, augers, various other equipment that, you don't really have that margin of error that if you hit something, you're not going to notice it. You're just going to fly right through it. So the reason why we have these rules, and they call it the zone of tolerance, is within a requisite area. It's several feet, number of inches. Every state's different, be it 3 feet from center, wherever it is. Within that area, as you're going to imagine going along those markings, it has to be hand dug. And that contractor has to, they call it expose the cable, expose the utility. So you need to dig down, find out where it is, be able to see it with their eyes before they can ever use heavy equipment in that area. Problems come up where states differ as to the extent to which that zone of tolerance applies. Maybe one state is, 30 inches. The other state is 40 inches, right? Or whatever it could be. And then contractors are working in different states. They have different rules, different procedures, and cases come into play on that. But suffice it to say, big thing to note is the zone of tolerance. This is where most of the litigation comes into place. It's with a contractor. They're digging, 6 inches from the marking. They're like, well, the marking's supposed to be right there. It's like, no. You can't excavate 6 inches from the marking. You need to first expose it because we never know exactly where that cable is going to be. As Raven said, things shift underground, right? We have telecommunications lines, and for some of our clients on the East Coast that are over 100 years old, right? Old phone cables that are still in operation. So things shift underground, things move around. We never can be absolutely certain. That's why we have these rules that it needs to be, if it's marked within the zone of tolerance, hand dig with a shovel. Take your time, expose that utility before a contractor ever can use excavation equipment. Right, Raven?
Absolutely.
Now, Raven, what happens, and this happens often, what happens when a contractor comes upon a cable or utility that was not marked? They're digging, they had marked some other facilities, but there it is 10 feet from the line. They start digging and, oh, wow, look at that conduit right in front of their face. What do they have to do?
Sure. So if the contractor has not hit the line, so if for some instance they have not struck or damaged this line, the contractor should stop what they're doing. So depending on if they're able to tell if it's a private or a public line, they should call 811 again. Let them know that there's an unmarked line here. They'll have to unfortunately stop what they're doing. 811 will probably send another person out to determine the owner of the line if they can, or remark the entire plat area. So essentially you'd have to stop what you're doing and kind of remark the entire premises just to make sure that this specific line would be accounted for, and potentially any others that are hiding out there. So that's kind of what you can do if you have not struck and damaged the line. If you have struck and damaged the line, you will need to contact 811, contact your private locate company, whoever came out and did that, if the contractor hired a private locate company, which is a big issue that we run into pretty often, is maybe they called 811, but they didn't hire a private locate service. So you want to contact both 811 and USIC or whoever privately located and try and locate the owner and notify the owner of that line that it has been damaged.
And the big thing to note there is a lot of times these contractors, they'll be digging, they'll hit that conduit. They'll realize it wasn't marked, and they'll just assume, oh, it's abandoned. Oh, it would have been marked if it mattered. And then they'll just legitimately remove it. I've had some where it's really heavy electrical cables, and next thing you know, they dig into it and somebody's zapped, right? This can happen. It happens often. A lot of times we have a lot of cases out in the Midwest where there's legacy oil wells, right? Where these oil wells and different wells have been running through farmers' properties for, 80, 100 years, longer, for many, many years. And there are a ton of abandoned lines, right? Abandoned piping. And frankly, they don't go out and just remove that piping. It just stays there. So oftentimes farmers are excavating, trenching, and they dig down, and there you go. There's a line. It wasn't marked. Well, I've had a number of cases where then they realize, well, it must be abandoned. They just remove it. Well, then oil starts to flow, and they realize, oh, wow, I created some huge environmental disaster. Because it wasn't one of a number of reasons. One, the marking company could have been wrong. Two, it could be that the utility company, the oil provider, somebody else didn't register with the marking company, with 811, to show their line was there. But either way, if that contractor just hits it when it's not marked, they're not responsible just for hitting it, right? That is likely going to fall on someone else, either on the utility company or the marking company. But when they decide to then take action to remove more of it, or to damage it further, that's where they are still responsible. And a lot of litigation in our claims kind of surround around that, where the contractor says, I'm not responsible. It was mismarked. It wasn't there. It's like, sure. Well, then we're not saying you're responsible for just the initial strike, but you then went forward with removing 30 feet of cable, right? You are responsible for that. So there's a lot that comes in on that. So just keep in mind, just because it's not marked, just because it's maybe not even listed with 811, doesn't necessarily mean that contractor can just do whatever they want. They still have duties and responsibilities. There are handbooks, nationwide handbooks, and also every state has different rules and regulations as to the duties and obligations of a contractor in these scenarios. Now, another kind of unique one, but something we see often, is the situation where the markings, it was appropriately marked. Everyone went through the right process. They called 811, marking company came out, but then maybe some weather event came through. Oftentimes we see snow, right? It was marked before snow. Next thing you know, snow covers the ground. Guess what? You can't see the markings anymore. Or oftentimes rain. Rain can wash away paint. We've had heavy rainstorms that have washed away and obscured some of these markings. Also construction sites, they're full of dirt. I've had a ton of these cases where the contractors, be it the one that actually called it in or somebody else, their predecessor working out there, they were digging things up, and next thing you know, they covered up a bunch of the utility markings. So that can be huge. And the question then becomes, who is responsible for ensuring that those markings are accurate at that point? Who has to ask for that remark? Walk me through, Raven, kind of that process and what you've seen.
Sure. So the contractors, the subcontractors, these project managers, the person who's actually performing work on the site is going to be responsible for requesting that remark from 811 and your private locate companies. So especially here in Wisconsin, it can snow as late as April and early May. So sometimes the weather will play tricks on us. We think the weather's suitable to start, doing some of those digging projects around the house. And suddenly we have a big snowstorm or a big thunderstorm. It blows your flags away. It washes away the spray paint markings on the ground. And you think, well, I remember where they were. This is my problem. I have an idea of where they were, but all full stop there. You want to stop and you want to reach out and get a remark. So essentially the person who's performing the work, the company who hired contractors to perform the work, all of these individuals are going to be responsible for making sure that those marks are up to date, current, and still visible. And sometimes these weather events can also cause your ticket to expire. So usually 811, you only have a ticket to perform work for a set period of time, sometimes 10 days, 30 days. So if a big snowstorm completely stops all of your digging and excavation work for 2 weeks, maybe that permit or that authorization from USIC, your ticket is expired. So it's also important, and it falls on that contractor to make sure that your ticket is up to date. So in those instances, they're going to be responsible for one, either extending their ticket and getting that line and scene remarked.
Yeah, because the utility company and the marking company, they can only guarantee accuracy within the window of that ticket. So the work needs to be done within that window. That's a big thing. So claims come in many different ways. Obviously, the most obvious, contractor goes out there and digs without even calling 811, hits a line. Well, they're going to be responsible. That's easy. Contractor goes out there, they have it appropriately marked, they start digging, they use an excavator within 2 inches of the of the marking, they hit the line, they're going to be responsible. There's also these other unique situations, like when they remove that line, as I said, despite the fact it wasn't marked and they further damage it, or when it snows and they just decide not to call in a remark. I've actually had an interesting case I saw where a bunch of, young teenage kids went out there and they decided to spray paint all around the markings. And it was very obvious. They put a bunch of smiley faces. They had some swear words, different things. And interestingly enough, they also just put markings in random different places. So the contractor gets out there, sees it, and they just assume, oh, well, they must have just been spray painting the other things. They didn't mess with the actual markings, and they still proceeded, and then realized that they actually did. They actually removed, they messed with some of the flags, they did different things. And we were able to show that contractor was negligent because they should have realized, well, somebody messed with this, right? Even though it was an intervening cause that somebody else was, went out there and caused this damage, caused the remark or the markings to no longer be accurate. They then had the requisite level of understanding, and the reasonable person would have said, yeah, we shouldn't just dig, we should ask for a remark. Very easy to get a remark, and it's a negligent standard. So we're able to show they're responsible and recover on that one. So now moving on from that, now aside from the contractor, which is pretty obvious, are there any other potential parties that we could pursue? Maybe the marking companies or anyone else that could be negligent? Raven, walk me through a little bit about, when we can hold a marking company responsible.
Sure. So whenever you're on site and you've got a contractor who's struck a line, there are certain situations where maybe a line wasn't marked at all. So this situation kind of that we hinted at earlier where a contractor comes upon a line that wasn't marked. Oops, they hit it. They threw it out, or maybe they just kept digging. They assumed that line was abandoned, but it was owned by a telecommunications company. It was registered, and somehow this private locate company just missed it. So typically in this situation, you would do a trouble ticket. So you would call your private locate company, let them know that there's been damage, and essentially let them know that they may be on the hook for this. So a lot of contractors who strike the lines, that's their favorite defense is, it wasn't marked properly, it was outside of that zone of tolerance. So that's when you kind of have to turn and change gears and start looking at, well, let's look at the extent of this private locate. Were any other lines missing? Was it marked with a wrong color? Or essentially you do a lot of investigation to see, is the private locate company even responsible? So typically you would open an investigation, a trouble ticket with your private locate company and go from there. But there certainly are situations where you can pursue that private locate company. A lot of our clients don't like to do that since there are so few across the entire nation. There are kind of 2 or 3 major private locate companies. So they typically don't like to do that unless it's just clear cut, this company is responsible. But there are a lot of situations where lines aren't marked or are inaccurately marked, or just similar situations where we can definitely pursue that private locate company.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned the color of the locate. So I kind of want to dig into that. It's a perfect segue. So, this is fast. So when I started to learn about like what the markings mean and the colors, like you can't unlearn it. It's kind of like the movie The Matrix, right? You start see it now, you start seeing things differently. It's like when I started representing trucking companies. Next thing you know, all I see is clients driving down the road. Or, people talk about, now you drive a Subaru. Now all you see is Subarus. It's similar to this, that when I started learning what the markings mean, now every time I go on a walk, I see these markings because they're everywhere. And, now It's like, you understand it's like cryptography in a way. But in the end, the marking companies, they either use spray paint, oftentimes they use flags, or a combination of both. And it all means different things. The way the markings are structured, how they're laid out, and also their color. Let's walk through that a bit. Raven, tell us a bit about what the different colors are and what they mean.
Sure. So fortunately for us, this is a situation where it's actually pretty uniform across the board. So the American National Standards Institute has a basically array of colors and how those colors are assigned to certain lines. So we, like Ashton said, we often see these in spray paint markings or flags, a combination of both. But essentially our red flags, our red spray paint, that's going to be your electric. So power lines, cables, conduits, lighting cables. Then we have orange, which is our telecommunication, alarms, signals, cables, conduits. Yellow is our natural gas, oil, steam, petroleum, and flammable materials. We have green for sewer and drain lines. Blue is going to be drinking water. Purple is reclaimed water, irrigation, and slurry lines. Pink is sometimes unknown, unidentified. They're not totally sure what this line is, but they're going to mark it to be safe or temporary survey. And then finally, we have our white line. So this is going to be the proposed excavation. So this is where the contractor marks where they plan to be excavating and their route of excavation.
And I promise you, after listening to this and us discuss this, you are going to see this every time you go on a walk, right? You're going to know what you're looking at. It's important stuff, even if you don't handle these cases. These are the funny things that, the bane of my family's existence and dealing with me is the random facts I talk about. And now they know, right? I'm pointing out, I'm like, hey, look over there. It's an electrical line. Oh, cool, Dad. Some people look at birds. I look at electrical lines, apparently. Either way. So not only the colors are relevant, but also there's a systemized notation system that kind of outlines like the secret language that you can start deciphering. And so the Common Ground Alliance, the CGA, maintains a guideline for operator field or facility field delineation, kind of indicating, what lines and how these things should be marked, right? Color is part of it, but also the way that it's marked. Now, the most common way would be just a dashed line, right? Straight dashed line going along where that cable's running, right? Obviously, that's giving you the zone of tolerance around it. It's not saying it's right underneath it, but it's usually pretty accurate because the equipment these locators use now, these are thousands and thousands of dollars for these systems that are able to give you a good line and good read on where the line is located. But the straight dash line, that means single line, single facility. The color is going to tell you what it is. Orange, telecommunications, red, power, energy, whatever it would be. So that's one way. Most common you'll see. The other way it can be marked is to mark the outside edges of the facility with a horizontal line drawn through the center to form an H shape. So basically, it gives more room and it's kind of show you more of that area of tolerance. A lot of times that's used for larger conduits, lines that may be bigger, larger cables, or just some locators just prefer to use that metric or that systemized notation. So really what it is, it's, imagine an H, you'll see it along the ground. Estimated, at the center of that H is where the cable should be. Another marking you'll see is a diamond shape. If you see a diamond shape on the ground, what that's saying is it's saying there's a conduit under there. So that's a larger facility. Oftentimes in those conduits, there can be numerous cables, even cables from multiple utility companies. And that marking is kind of outlining what it is. Oftentimes it'll also, with that marking, there'll be other words with it. They'll spray paint, let's say telco or whatever it is, saying the name of the company who owns that conduit. And it'll also oftentimes include what it is. So sometimes you'll see like a 4x4 inch, saying it's a 4-inch, you'll see a PLA next to it. That means plastic. So it's giving that contractor, the person digging there, a better idea of what they're going to see under the ground. Another thing that you'll see is arrows. Oftentimes there might be a situation where it's not possible or practical to mark with spray paint or something else exactly where the facility is going to be located. So there'll be an arrow pointing towards where it is, and then it'll say distance on there. It'll say, 5 feet from arrow, pointing multiple arrows, what it could be. Another marking that's important to note would be the no conflict markings. A lot of times you'll have the area of excavation, which is outlined maybe a circle or a square where they're planning to dig. And then within there, somebody's going to mark right on the outside. They'll put, a G with a circle around it and then an X through it. And then no. What that means is it's saying that there's no gas line, right? It's no conflict. So they'll mark it in the color of what it is, make it very available. So either they'll have the mark with the G and the X through it, or a line through it, or they'll have just, in orange paint, they'll see, no name of telecommunications company, conflict. In some way, you'll see markings with, the line, X through it, and somehow saying no conflict, meaning that there's no buried lines or utilities for that company that you need to worry about. Makes sense, right? Any other comments on that, Raven?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
All right, so let's jump over. Let's say, Raven, tell me a bit about the damages we see on these claims and why it is that, frankly, damages can be huge, right? We'll see, contractor simply, digs into a cable, and next thing you know, it's $50,000 to repair. Tell me a bit about the damages and why it can be so expensive.
So these damages, even our smaller claims, are usually about $20,000. And this is likely because most of these underground, especially communications cables, these are, 24 gauge copper wire pairs. Hundreds of feet have to be replaced based on one small hit. So even our smaller claims typically necessitate replacement of at least 1,000 feet of these underground buried copper cables, which will definitely start to add up. And depending on disruption in services, you also have administrative costs, loss of use damages as well, depending on the extent of the damage, whether it caused certain outages and how long that cable and how long that service was disrupted. So we have a lot of factors at play here that can make these hits extremely expensive. And sometimes we're able to repair those in a short term using a process called splicing. So sometimes a contractor on site will strike a cable and they'll quickly splice it and then move along. So essentially what splicing is it's supposed to be a semi-permanent solution. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, I mean, regarding splicing, I can jump in on that. So, I mean, a lot of times the contractors, these cases get so complex because oftentimes we're either on other subrogation matters, we're dealing with either liability or damages. It's usually not both. But on these cases, it's oftentimes both, right? They're arguing liability issues. Hey, it wasn't marked, this or that. But then they're also oftentimes coming into us on damages, even on the most obvious cases, right? Where a contractor just simply says, forget it. I'm not going to call them 811. I'm just going to start digging with a backhoe. They hit a line. Well, then it's usually not just, sure, they admit liability there. Good news is they're usually always insured. So these are good case in that regard because oftentimes people don't hire. These are usually larger projects that we're involved with. So, they're usually hired, bonded, insured, licensed individuals. But either way, so liability and damage is an issue. On damages, though, a lot of times these contractors have a really hard time understanding we just hit a cable and it's not even a big cable. How is it costing this much? You can just splice it. And what a splice is you're pretty much just splicing, putting together the two cables. There's some kind of fancy, equipment and technology to do so. But ultimately, that's solving the issue. It gets it back in service. But we have to then explain why it is that splice is not a reasonable long-term solution. As I mentioned, we have cables that have been out down there, telecom cables, for 100 years, right? These are expected to last a very long time. And a splice is a great short-term solution. But one, you lose energy, you lose data, you lose process when you have a splice because it's not a perfect fit. It's not a perfect connection. So what happens is they actually often have to connect between, let's say an aerial between the two poles, right? You can't just splice in the middle of that aerial. You need to actually go between the two poles, which can be hundreds, thousands of feet to get it back to the position where that telecommunications where that utility company was pre-loss, right? That's what they deserve. They get to be in their pre-loss condition. And to do so, oftentimes it requires more than just a simple splice, a short-term solution. Secondly, I mean, splices last only so long, right? It's not going to last nearly as long. There's a lot of room for a splice if it's underground to be damaged by water. There's just there's a ton more room for error, which is why a lot of times we have to argue on damages, explain why with expert testimony, whatever we need to show that, hey, splicing was not the actual appropriate solution, but it's a solution in the end. And oftentimes we also need to explain why it is that defendant seeing a $7,500 invoice for splicing and then another, $50,000 for replacing that line. Reason is there's a lot of people that are serviced by these utilities. The loss of use, the time down can be huge. They can't be down for, 3 weeks, 2 months, waiting for this full line to be replaced and repaired. It needs to be put into service immediately, which we really have no issue proving that up in litigation when we have to. But a lot of times contractors who maybe don't know everything about it, you need to know enough to be able to explain this to them. So that's why it's very important. Anything else on that, Raven?
No, I think you covered it, Ashton.
Excellent. Now, another thing I wanted to discuss is kind of the other claims we see, aside from these misdig claims, involved with these clients of ours who own the facilities, own the utilities. Walk me through what other type of claims that you've handled and we've seen through the firm.
Sure, and we touched on these briefly. So a lot of these that we see, especially when 811 is not called, is we have a standard homeowner who installed these brand new stairs and they want to put in handrails. They're digging in their garden and suddenly they strike a line, and that's where we come in. And then we also see strike of aerial cables. So I've had some cases where maybe there wasn't an excavation project, but there was a similar construction project and someone backed up a piece of equipment and they strike a pole, or they have a crane and they hit an aerial line. And we also see, even from a more basic standpoint, so we see tractors and semis in automobile collisions where a vehicle will strike a utility pole, a pedestal, or similar equipment for these private telecommunications companies, which also result in outages. So we see more than just misdig claims. We tend to cover a lot of these facilities kind of across the board.
Right. And the other ones are relatively standard. I mean, the auto collisions, or let's say a lawnmower strikes a pedestal, which pedestal is kind of that standing thing that has the utilities, the wires, everything going through it. Then, I mean, it's just a standard auto negligence case, right? Showing that they were negligent, they should have seen it. They obviously weren't paying attention. The strikes on aerial cable, those can be a bit more complex because usually the defendant has a defense where they say, well, obviously we wouldn't have hit it if the line wasn't low hanging. At which point we then, I've gone to neighbors to get, Ring doorbell footage. We've gone to businesses to show, hey, somehow all these other trucks larger than yours went through. Obviously there was something off. Oftentimes we find out that, oh yeah, they had the dump truck had the dump basket, something up. The excavator had, that it was boomed out, whatever it could be. There's different things that come in there. And speaking of those things, an evidentiary burden, I think before we wrap this up, I do want to kind of briefly get into kind of the evidentiary issues we see with these cases. I think that it's important to note that a lot of times, the telecommunications company here, the utility company, they don't really know exactly what happened, right? They only know that something happened, somebody hit their line, and now people are out of service. Hopefully the damager contacts 811 or contacts the utility company, say, hey, I hit your line. What do we do? And on those, it's pretty straightforward. But on a lot of them, we just find out, oh yeah, it was out of service. Day later, somebody contacted us saying the internet wasn't working. We then sent somebody out and a technician realized, oh, look, there's a big dig site right here and somebody hit the line. At which point we're kind of stuck. I mean, it's like putting a puzzle. You're putting a puzzle pieces together, like the energy company MacGyver trying to figure this stuff out. And it gets fascinating because a lot of times we'll have to then go to 811, run the ticket, figure out who was working on the site at the time. We really only know oftentimes who pulled the ticket. Sometimes we can go to the building department, the local department, and figure out, hey, who is on site, who is actually, has permits to do excavation work. Sometimes we can figure it that way. Other times, all we know is, hey, a ticket was requested for this area, and we have that company name, but these are building projects. If you do with anything construction related, sure, there's one company that may have asked for the ticket. There could be one GC, or there could be 30 subcontractors under them. So there are a lot of these cases where it's just finger pointing. And when we file suit, we have no choice but to litigate against numerous parties. Some states, some jurisdictions, we can just pursue the GC, and that makes life a whole lot easier. But there's plenty of other states and jurisdictions where we have to identify that sub. And sometimes that's not possible, right? Oftentimes it's not possible until we actually start hitting people with some discovery and having depositions. But evidence is a big issue on these cases, which is why, frankly, we see so many of them and why attorneys are, good qualified counsel is so important for these clients. Raven, anything to add there?
Yeah. So as soon as we get these types of claims from our clients, we're looking for pictures. So this is something that we try and tackle immediately. So we want to investigate as much as we can, especially if the mistake happened recently. Sometimes we get these a little bit later, which I can get into. But essentially, whenever we get these claims, we want to look at documentation. We want pictures. We want names of everyone who's on site. I've seen a couple of instances where our client, the telecommunications company, will actually have an engineer or have some kind of representative from the company on site during the project, which is always helpful. So we want to get the name and the contact information for as many people that were on site as possible, get kind of a feel for what exactly happened, the names of subcontractors like Ashton had mentioned, and we want to investigate what exactly happened. We want to get pictures of markings because if in fact these were mismarked or the private company maybe missed a couple of lines, we want to have documentation of everything. So essentially investigation in these claims is super important, and we want to get in touch with as many people as possible to kind of determine and narrow down that liability.
Right. And one thing to note is, we're trying to train our clients in this regard that anybody here who works for a telecommunications company, works for a utility provider, make sure that you have an appropriate protocol in place to get a photograph of the damaged area zoomed out, showing everything shortly after the loss. Because one difficult thing on these cases is usually the markings company will take pre-marking and post-marking photos. So they'll take photos after they do their mark showing where it is. But it gets really tough when, damage occurred. Sometimes even the contractor damages the line and buries it, right? Or does something else. And sometimes we'll just get these cases where we just have a photo of the damaged line, right? And we have nothing showing where it was. And we need to use GPS data to do so. So I tell everyone, evidence is huge here. It's our burden of proof on most of this. So if you are working with a client, if you are an insurance carrier handling these cases, if you're a homeowner who has a case where somebody digs into their facility, make sure somebody gets out there immediately after the loss and documents where the damage occurred, because we can do overlay photographs, and we do often. We're able to line up the photo with the pre-dig with the pre-dig markings and those photos and show, look, this is exactly where it was. Even if we don't necessarily have, something showing on photo, here's a big flag where the damage is. But photos, evidence is huge. I had a case, sometimes we can put that MacGyver hat on again. I have one just recently, whereas, we had a photograph of the damaged cable. We had photographs of the pre-dig markings and a photograph just on the construction site. And we're able to look at the photograph of the damage and show exactly where the dirt was. I mean, the dirt kind of formed a weird little, mosaic pattern in a way. And we're able to line that up with another photo showing the same mosaic pattern. And in a way, we're able to show, yes, this is where it was. But it takes a lot of digging. It takes creativity. These aren't cases where we can just kind of sit back, not investigate, and just make a demand and get paid. We need to be prepared to do our digging, to get creative. And, in doing so, and taking the time, I think we can do a really good job for those clients, right? Which is another reason why I do encourage any clients who handle these cases, find qualified counsel who knows what they're doing. Make sure that counsel that's handling it is trained up on how these things work. If you're an adjuster handling these cases, contact me, contact somebody who knows these things to kind of get a quick, 101 lesson on what you're looking at. Because oftentimes these are not cases where you can just send some template demand letters every 5 months and then hope to get a result, right? It requires, pun intended, it requires your hands to get dirty here, right? You need to do some digging. You need to excavate the dirt and the facts and get to where you want to be. That's enough excavation jokes. That's what I'd say. I mean, investigation wise, these are really labor intensive cases, and they require somebody who knows the intricacies, right? Who can read those cryptic symbols and can understand that. And I mean, it's not rocket science. People can learn it pretty quickly, but we kind of discussed the 101 here. But I encourage anyone, if you're handling these cases, if you're interested, reach out to me. I have other materials. I'm fascinated by this stuff. I'm a subro nerd when it comes down to it. So don't hesitate to reach out. But Raven, anything else you want to discuss? Any other tips, tricks, or rules of the road for people?
I don't think so. A lot of these claims are pretty easily resolved without litigation, especially given the low damages. So it's really just, getting it to qualified counsel, getting it in our hands and making some calls and negotiating some of these down. Important to note that sometimes certain damages like administrative costs aren't recoverable in certain states. So kind of managing expectations for recovery. But a lot of times we're able to get these resolved relatively quickly.
And I always love to tie it back to other podcasts I've done. The Bomb Throwing Demand podcast I did, I think two times ago, 2 sessions ago. We talked about the importance of sending a bomb throwing demand letter, including photographs, documents, diagrams. And these would be some of those cases where that can be hugely impactful. I've had cases where, the client sent to, different clients, and people have sent demand letters over and over again. They've just said no. Well, next thing you know, we get those photographs. We put it in a consistent form. We show, hey, I understand this is hard to understand, but just look at these photographs. But let me lead this horse to water. Let me show you, here's the post marking photos. Here's the damage location. Here's what shows and ties it together to show this was within the requisite zone of tolerance. This is our demand. Bam. Next thing you know, they come back and they offer to pay a claim that nobody's offered on in, 6 months, a year. So in the end, just remember that these are perfect cases, given the complexity and the unique nature of evidence and importance of photographs, where we don't want to just send template demands. We want to take the time, build it out, lead that horse to water, show the adverse how they can pay you. So in the end, that's really all I got for you. Raven, I've really appreciated your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me. Audience, again, thank you all so much. That's all I have. It's Ashton Kirsch today, signing off from the Subrogation Support Network podcast. Until next time, thank you.